There are villages that exist on maps and others that only survive in whispers. Coastal winds off northeastern Scotland carried one such whisper through the bones of fishermen, and into the lungs of their daughters. They spoke of a cursed place, eerily, where children were born breathless, and where grief became so common it needed no name. But in the year 1841, that whisper changed. A midwife arrived, not by horse nor by foot, but as if summoned by the silence itself. She was pale, older than she looked, and spoke rarely, only to ask, "Is it your first?" No one knew her name, no one remembered her leaving. But the children, they started breathing, just not speaking, ever again. So the real question is not why the children died before. The real question is, what was she doing with the breath she saved? Eerily had always been strange, even by highland standards. Tucked between cliffs and whispering moors, it was the sort of place travelers passed without stopping, a place hidden in folds of fog and half-remembered warnings. Its cottages leaned inward like eavesdroppers, as though the land itself was listening. Roofs bowed, chimneys curled like bent necks, walls bled moss as if the stone wept in silence. Even the trees, gnarled rowans and stunted ash, seemed to grow not outward, but inward, their limbs retreating from the world. There were no church bells. The old kirk's tower still stood, but the bells had cracked in 1817 and were never replaced. The story went that they shattered mid-peal, just as a newborn died in his mother's arms. The villagers said the bells had caught the sound of death, and so the kirk was left abandoned, sealed with sea stones and red twine. No one sang lullabies. Mothers rocked their children in silence. Cribs were carved without decoration. Toys were unpainted. Even the lull of the sea, so near, only half a mile down the cliffs, seemed muffled, as if it too feared to make sound. And there were no mirrors in eerily after sunset. Every home had rules. Cover the glass by dusk, draw curtains tight, and never, ever, speak a name aloud after midnight. Names gave shape, sound gave life, and life, in eerily, was something to be paid for. In the 7 years before 1841, not a single child in eerily had lived beyond 6 minutes, not 6 hours, not 6 days, 6 minutes, exactly. The women would carry their babies to term, the labor would begin, the cries would start, short, thin, gasping, and then nothing, a shudder, a silence, a weightless stillness that filled the room like fog. The doctor from Inverness, who came in 1830 for left, after only one birth. He was found packing his bags at 3 a.m., mumbling that the walls had whispered his name. Another physician tried to open a small practice the following year, but quit after his ink froze in its pot. During a midsummer night, no one else ever came. The ministers fared no better. One tried to perform mass blessings. Another attempted an exorcism on the entire village. A third spoke Latin prayers into the wells. None of them stayed longer than a fortnight. It was as though eerily had been forgotten, abandoned by medicine, forsaken by faith, and folded into itself like a wound healing wrong. The villagers blamed a curse, not aloud, of course, but in glances and half-muttered things. A punishment, they whispered, passed down through bloodlines. A curse tied to a name most would not speak. In 1702, a midwife had been drowned just off the southern bluff. She had been found muttering in her sleep, clutching a bag of salt and black feathers, her window always open to the sea. The villagers said she talked to it, sang to it, in a language no one understood. She had no grave, no marker, only a flat stone slab near the cliffs, carved with a single word, Dwined, the one who closes. Some said she was pagan, others said she was never born at all, only emerged from the waves one night and walked into town as though she had always belonged. But they killed her just the same, bound her in fishing net, filled her mouth with sea pebbles, and dropped her into the tide at low moon. Now, they said, she lived in the womb of eerily women, not as flesh, but as silence, a hunger for breath, a gate that no child could pass through whole. But if that was true, if the curse had really taken root, then what came next should have never happened. Because in February of 1841, a woman came to eerily, and the children began to live. She had no luggage, no papers, Her hands were wrapped in linen, though no one could say why. She did not knock. She did not speak her name. She simply arrived, just after the full moon, and took residence in the abandoned stone house, near the one no one had lived in since 1809. She brought no candles, cooked nothing, slept with no fire. But within 3 days, she had delivered a child, and that child lived. 6 minutes passed, then 10, then an hour. It did not cry, but it breathed. Then she delivered another, and another, and another. The village rejoiced, but quietly, always quietly. The women brought her bread and dried fish. Men nodded in thanks, though their eyes avoided hers. No one dared ask how she had done it, or why the babies never cried, because they did not once, not when fed, not when pricked, not when cold. They would stare up at their mothers with wide, wet eyes and listen, as if their ears had replaced their mouths, as if the breath inside them had not been given, but sealed. As the weeks passed, something else began to shift. The sound of doors creaking faded. Waves along the coast grew duller, as though the sea was being muffled. Dogs stopped barking. Roosters did not crow. And even laughter, what little there had been, dried from the air like mist. The midwife never left her cottage except to deliver. But children began to linger outside her window, staring, not speaking, sometimes placing their palms against the glass, as if trying to hear something on the other side. One night, a mother claimed to hear her baby humming in its sleep, a tune no one recognized. The next morning, her child was gone, the crib empty, the floor wet with brine. Still, the woman remained. Still, the babies were born. No one knew her name, but the villagers called her something, quietly. When they thought no one listened, they called her the one who opens, because if the drowned midwife had closed the breath of children, this woman had opened something else, and whatever it was listening. They called her the midwife, but no one ever saw her deliver anything other than silence. She appeared one evening just after the frost had turned the hills white. No horse, no cart, just her figure, trailing along the stone path into eerily. The hem of her wool cloak soaked in peat water. Her boots left no sound, though the road was gravel. Her breath did not cloud in the cold. When asked where she had come from, she would only say, "From further in." Further in? Into what? The villagers would exchange glances, but never press her. There was something about the weight of her words, like a door closing behind you, softly. Finally, when asked her name, she replied, "Names are for those who need to be called." She spoke little, and only when necessary. But it was not her silence that unnerved the villagers. It was the way the world around her seemed to hold its breath. She wore a locket, old and brassy, hanging low against her chest, yet it bore no photo, no initials, only a faint circular scratch on its surface, as if something had once tried to claw its way out. She never ate in public, never coughed, never bled, not even when a fisherman's dog bit through her hand one morning near the docks. She simply stared at the wound, expressionless, and wrapped it again in linen while the dog retched and collapsed, tongue blackened. And she never, not once, smiled at the living. The Dunley invitation. Margaret Dunley was the first to extend something like kindness. A young mother, cautious but curious, whose daughter, Ruth, had been the first baby in years to survive more than a week. She invited the midwife to their home for supper. It was meant to be a thank you, though perhaps part of it was hunger, not for food, but for explanation. The woman accepted with a nod. That evening, the fire crackled in the hearth, the smell of smoked lamb and boiled oats hanging warm in the air. Margaret laid out a tray, polished the old silver, set the wooden bowls carefully. The midwife sat still, her back unnaturally straight, hands folded in her lap beneath sleeves that seemed too long for her arms. Before touching the food, she reached out slowly and tapped her spoon on the wooden tray, once, twice, thrice, 4 times, 5. A rhythm, a pattern. It was not nervousness, it was ritual. Margaret's husband, Thomas, tried to keep his voice light. Is that a prayer? The woman turned her head toward him slowly, not like a person hearing, but like a creature detecting motion. Her eyes, gray and opaque like morning ice, held his for a moment too long. To warn them, she replied. Warn who? She said nothing more. She did not eat. She left as quietly as she had come. That night they heard it just after midnight, whispering beneath the floorboards, not voices exactly, but breath made into shape, coiling, hissing, forming words in no tongue that belonged to this land. Margaret pressed her ear to the wooden floor. What she heard made her recoil. Not the sound, the silence between the syllables. It was too perfect, too practiced, like something rehearsed for centuries in places where light does not reach. By morning, their chimney was stuffed, clogged with a cold, milky residue, and on every stone inside the flew fog marks, as though dozens of tiny mouths had exhaled against the inner walls, leaving breath prints in the soot. No animal could have done it. No human could have fit. The chimney sweep they called refused to touch it. He left muttering about banshees and ancestral debts unpaid. Ruth, their daughter, Ruth, lived, but not without change. By her third birthday, Ruth had not spoken a word. Doctors said she was slow, or perhaps deaf, but that was not it. Ruth heard everything. She simply chose not to respond. She would stare into corners as if they contained scenes others could not see. She would wake in the night and hum, not songs, but disjointed notes and patterns that, when reversed on a phonograph, formed words, old words, dead ones. One afternoon, Margaret found her in the pantry, whispering softly to the wall. The words were wet and clumsy, like someone learning to speak for the first time using another's tongue. What are you saying, love?" Ruth turned and smiled. Her eyes were glassy. "Not mine," she said. "They just wanted to be remembered." The other sit did not happen only to the Dunleys. Other families began to report similar incidents. A boy in the North Cottage cried tears of seawater when he was scolded. Twins born to the Harrisons would sleep with their eyes open, watching the ceiling like it moved. One child spoke only in riddles, and only when the wind blew west. These children did not die, but something about them remained borrowed, like guests wearing the skin of something human. The woman's absence of history. Villagers grew restless. Some began to ask where the midwife had lived before Aberlay. No one knew. No one had seen her arrive by the main road. They asked if she had family. She answered, "Only those who arrive head first," and covered in breath. They asked if she was Christian. She replied, "I walk beside things that remember the time before choices." An elder tried to draw her blood once, claiming to test her health. The needle bent. She did not flinch. She simply said, softly, "They do not like to be measured." The map with no roads. When a local constable from Inverness came asking questions, part of a census project, he asked to document her birth origin. She handed him a folded piece of parchment. It was a map, old, stained, and curling at the edges, but it had no roads, only shapes of land and sea, and one symbol, a black spiral etched over the center of what looked like the highlands. "Where is this?" "Further in," she said again. The constable left that evening and was never seen again. His horse returned the next day, without the saddle, without the bit, only a single fog print on its flank. The first to notice were the children. They began pointing at empty corners, mouthing things they could not say. Some tapped on windows at midnight from the inside. Others would not sleep unless a jar was placed beside their bed, its lid unscrewed and facing the ceiling. No one understood it, but the village obliged. It was better than hearing their children sob without sound. By early spring of 1841, the midwife had delivered 11 children, all alive, all voiceless, and each of their mothers began waking with dry mouths and frost on their cheeks. Even in warmth, they began coughing without sound, drinking without thirst. Some forgot the taste of bread. Others stopped dreaming altogether. Margaret Dunley noticed something stranger still. One morning, while cleaning near the cradle, she found her child holding a glass jar, its mouth fogged over, as though someone had exhaled inside it. The child stared into it, smiled, then shook it and giggled, though no sound came. Margaret took the jar and peered into it. There was nothing, but that night, she heard breathing on the shelf where it sat. Word began to spread. The jars were not innocent. They were full. The village baker, Mr. Alistair Keene, decided to test it. He took one such jar from a neighbor's child, sealed it, and buried it deep under the roots of a yew tree. Within days, that yew withered from the tips of its branches, downward, as though something had sucked the breath from its roots. Keen did not last much longer. He was found crouched in his cellar, surrounded by broken jars, each lined with faint frost. On his face was the look of a man who had been listening too long. The midwife never explained, but she never stopped coming. She moved from home to home, wrapping her hands tighter, never letting anyone touch her skin. One old man swore he saw her once, in the forest, under the bleeding moon, holding a jar high in the air. Something moved inside it. Not a light, not a flame. Something. Then came the letters, folded into cracks of doors, written in childlike script. The silence is a bridge. Do not call them. They will answer. The jars are not to keep breath. They are to keep it out. On the 4th week of summer, a child, the 12th, was born with no heartbeat. The midwife stayed longer that night. She asked for a mirror, something no one in Eerily had kept since the curse. Margaret Dunley fetched one from an old barn, wrapped in rags. The midwife placed it beside the infant, sat beside it in complete darkness. The next morning, the child was alive, but the mirror had cracked down the center. And in the reflection, there were 13 people in the room. By midsummer, Eerily had grown quieter than ever, not from peace, but pressure, like a held breath, like a hymn cut off at the throat. Birdsong ceased. Footsteps made no echo. Even the sea, which once roared angrily against the cliffs, now pressed in with a muffled hush, as if ashamed to speak. And at the center of it all, the midwife, always walking, always watching, not aging, not blinking too long, and never once startled by anything behind her. On the morning of the solstice, the blacksmith's daughter vanished. 6-year-old Elsie Rowan, born under the midwife's hand, had not spoken a single word in her life, but her silence was the kind that drew people in. Her presence was calming, her eyes kind. She would sit by the hearth, turning spoons in her hand, smiling at the fire like it whispered to her in secret. She was last seen standing near the well, staring into it. When they searched, they found her shoes placed side by side beside the stone, perfectly clean. But inside the well, no splash, no body, only a scent, like milk left too long in sunlight, like old breath. The village demanded answers. For the first time, they knocked on the midwife's door. She did not answer, but the door creaked open slowly. Inside, the house was spotless, fireless, and cold. Glass jars sat along the shelves, all sealed, each labeled with a name, but not of living villagers. Ivor McLean, Greta Summers, Neil of the Sill, names that belonged to stillborns, infants who had died before breath. But the jars were not empty. Inside, there was movement, not seen, but felt, a presence that pressed against the glass when one stared too long. And then, a sound, not a whisper, not a word, a reverse sigh, as if something were inhaling through the listener. Margaret Dunley collapsed. By nightfall, no one spoke the midwife's name, not that anyone knew it. She was no longer seen by day. And yet, each week, a child was born. Each week, a jar appeared beside the cradle, and each week, something unseen was felt brushing past thresholds and windows, lingering just out of view, like a thought someone tried not to remember. One of the village elders, May Fenwick, tried to burn her jar. She took it to the old fields and smashed it open beside a pyre. Within seconds, her hair turned white. She walked into her cottage, locked the door, and began writing. Hundreds of pages, none in English. No one could translate the symbols, not even the monks from Oban who visited later that year. She died 3 days later, but her body never decayed. It simply dried, like a petal kept in pages too long. And still, no one spoke. Not the children, not the wind. Until the Dunley's daughter, one night before her 5th birthday, whispered for the first time, one word, Dwined, and every window in Eerily shattered inward. When the midwife disappeared, it was not a disappearance, it was a retreat, a folding inward, not of a body, but of a presence, as if something once thinly stretched across the village had finally recoiled back into its source. The people of Eerily never spoke of that night, but their silence deepened, thickened. It changed texture. not the silence of mourning, but of obedience. The children continued to grow, but they did not speak. Not even once. No cries at birth, no laughter in play, no screams in fear. Their lungs filled with air like anyone else's, but none of it left their mouths, not in word, not in song, not even in sleep. Some mothers claimed their children no longer needed to breathe, that their chests rose and fell only when someone was watching. And yet, on certain nights, when the wind blew inland and the waves withdrew from the shore, a sound would come from the cliffs, a long, low inhale, not from one mouth, but from dozens, hundreds, breathing as one. A single, massive intake that stretched across the hills like a windless gasp. She had gathered enough. No one dared speak her name, not in books, not in journals. Even among the elders, the midwife had become she who was once seen, not feared, not revered, simply endured. The villagers of Eerily turned their homes inward, windows sealed, fireplaces bricked. Even the church bell was removed, its silence deemed safer than its toll. They feared noise, not for what it might attract, but for what it might awaken. Then came the summer of 1902. A traveler, Alistair McKenna, a folklorist from Inverness, arrived after hearing rumors of a place where children had no voices, a place where the air itself hesitated. He expected poverty, isolation. What he found was far worse. Eerily was intact, beautiful even. Flower pots still hung from windows. Tables were set with freshly baked bread, still soft to the touch. Hearths smoldered. A teapot still steamed on a windowsill. But no people, no footsteps in the dust, no indentations on bedsheets, no signs of struggle, blood, rot, nothing. Just absence. Except for one thing: mirrors. Hundreds of them, placed carefully along the coastline, facing the sea. Small ones, cracked ones, full-length dress mirrors anchored in the sand like gravestones, all positioned with precision, as if something had instructed their placement, and each one fogged, not on the surface. From within. As if the glass itself had taken a breath and held it. McKenna's journal, found months later near the edge of Glen Kao Run, described the experience in brief. Broken entries, no birds, no gulls, even the sea is quiet. Tides roll but do not crash. Children's toys, still warm, dolls missing mouths, some buried face down in the dirt. Tried to speak, felt like I was choking on someone else's exhale. Heard it tonight, that long breath again, like a choir of lungs beneath the sea. The mirrors hum at night, not sound, vibration, like they are waiting to fog again. I think they are listening. His final line read, "There is no wind here, only what follows it." He was never seen again, but his voice was heard once, faint, on a wax cylinder recording he had posted before venturing to the cliffside. 6 seconds of static, and then a child's breath, not an inhale. An exhale, long, wet, slow. Followed by silence, and a single soft hum, the kind sung only when no one else is meant to hear. So the next time you pass through a quiet village, one where no one waves, where the trees lean slightly inland, away from the sea, where the children blink too slowly, and too often, ask yourself, is it peace or is it a pause? The calm not of nature, but of something ancient, patient, waiting to inhale again. They say she still walks the shore, not with feet, but with breath, pressing against doors' glass, lungs not entering, just brushing past, checking, searching, and sometimes when the waves are still and the wind holds its breath, you may find yourself standing before a mirror that fogs from the inside. If you do not wipe it, do not speak, do not breathe, because silence is no longer safety, it is a contract, and Dwinid remembers every mouth she sealed. Asterisk.